What does it mean to live each day under the shadow of violence? To wake up unsure if your family will survive the night? For countless settlers and native communities during the Wild West era, this wasn't just a fear. It was a daily truth. The American frontier was not a land of peace. It was a raw, untamed place where conflict, survival, and vengeance shaped every aspect of life. Among the many groups involved in this struggle, the Apache tribe stood out for their fierce resistance, their tactical brilliance, and their brutal treatment of women during times of war. To understand this violent chapter of history, we must explore how Apache raids unfolded, how women were captured, and what happened to them in captivity. These stories are not easy to hear, but they reveal important truths about the cost of survival and the depths of human cruelty. Raids fueled by survival. The Apache were not mindless aggressors. They were survivors, shaped by centuries of hardship and colonization. Living in the arid, punishing terrain of the Southwest, they mastered the art of guerrilla warfare, relying on hit-and-run raids to seize supplies, weapons, and horses. These raids were strategic. Settlements were targeted not just for resources, but to strike fear, to weaken enemies, and to secure the tribe's future. Women, unfortunately, were often the most vulnerable during these attacks. Capturing them served multiple purposes: labor, marriage, psychological warfare, and sometimes simple revenge. Historical records describe women being tied, dragged across miles of rocky terrain, starved, beaten, and humiliated. The 17th century Spanish friar Alonso de Benavides chronicled the indescribable suffering of captives taken by Apache warriors, a phrase that only begins to capture the horror these women endured. For the women taken, captivity meant the end of everything familiar. Families were lost, cultures erased, and identities overwritten. They were thrust into a world governed by the will of their captors, one where freedom no longer existed. The prison of forced marriage. One of the most psychologically devastating fates for captive women was forced marriage. Among the Apache, marriage was not just a personal bond, it was a political tool, a way to assimilate outsiders, strengthen alliances, and bind captives permanently to the tribe. Women taken from settler homes or rival tribes were often forced into marriages with Apache men. These unions were not based on love, choice, or consent. They were acts of domination. Once married, these women were expected to bear children, serve their new families, and show loyalty to the very people who had destroyed their previous lives. Stripped of language, community, and tradition, many captives became shadows of who they once were. Their former identities were erased. They were seen not as people, but as assets, tools to be used, wives to be controlled, mothers to be managed. Such marriages may have served the practical needs of the tribe, but for the women, they represented a complete loss of autonomy. The emotional trauma of being forced into such a life after losing one's home and family left scars that no amount of time could heal. Scalping, the ultimate message. The image of scalping is one of the most haunting legacies of the Wild West. To the Apache, scalping wasn't just a method of killing, it was a message, a grotesque symbol of power and intimidation. Women were not spared from this practice. In fact, they were often targeted specifically because of the symbolic weight their suffering carried. A scalped woman's body was more than a casualty. It was a warning to others. Scalps might be displayed publicly hung from poles, or worn as trophies. The meaning was simple. We are watching, we are capable, and we are not afraid to show our enemies what happens when they resist. Anthropologists have long debated where scalping originated. Some believe it was adopted from European settlers. Others trace it to ancient tribal customs. But regardless of its roots, the psychological effect was undeniable. For settlers and rival tribes, it sent a shiver down the spine. It was a declaration of dominance carved into the flesh of its victims. And yet, scalping was not limited to native tribes. Settlers, bounty hunters, and soldiers returned the violence in kind, often scalping native men, women, and children in acts of revenge or for government bounties. The brutality was cyclical, and women were often the most tragic victims, caught in the crossfire. Whipping and beating, breaking the spirit. For women in captivity, physical punishment was a constant threat. Whipping and beating weren't just tools of discipline. They were methods of psychological control. With each strike of the rawhide or blow of a club, the captors reinforced a simple message: you are no longer free. Women who disobeyed, resisted, or even showed signs of grief could be beaten into submission. These punishments were intended not just to hurt, but to destroy the will to fight back. Accounts from survivors tell of the horror inflicted on a regular basis. One such voice is that of Olive Oatman, a young settler girl captured in 1851. Though aspects of her story are debated, her accounts of being beaten and humiliated to ensure obedience echo the experience of countless other women lost to history. These punishments served a dark dual purpose: to keep captives in line and to showcase power. And in a society ruled by survival, power was everything. As burning and mutilation, a legacy of pain, among the most disturbing methods of punishment was the use of burning and mutilation. These acts were designed to do more than hurt. They were meant to mark, humiliate, and terrify. Women were sometimes burned with hot irons or forced to endure flames as punishment. Fingers were cut off, faces disfigured, and permanent scars inflicted with calculated cruelty. These acts were meant to make an example of the victim, to turn them into living warnings. Mutilation was more than physical. It robbed victims of dignity and identity. A woman who survived such treatment would carry the scars forever, not just on her body, but in her memory. Military reports and settler diaries document these horrific acts in grim detail. And while they often emphasize Apache cruelty, they also reveal that settlers and soldiers returned such violence with equal savagery. Apache women, too, were burned, mutilated, and killed in retaliatory attacks. It was a never-ending loop of revenge, a world where mercy was rarely found. Is the frontier's forgotten victims? What emerges from these stories is not a simple narrative of good and evil. It's a bleak portrait of a world ruled by fear, survival, and the erosion of humanity. The women caught in these conflicts were not warriors, politicians, or leaders. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters swept into a war they did not choose. Their suffering reminds us that history is not just about battles and borders. It's about the people who paid the price for power plays and survival strategies. The Wild West was not a place of honor or heroism. It was a brutal, unforgiving land where violence was currency. And yet, these women endured. Many survived. Some escaped. A few even rebuilt lives from the ruins of their past. But the scars remained, passed down through generations as silent testimony to the brutality of a forgotten war. Final reflection. As we look back on this grim history, we are forced to ask ourselves, what does it take for a society to survive, and what is lost in the process? The suffering of these women should never be reduced to footnotes or folklore. Their stories matter, not just because of the pain they reveal, but because of the humanity they remind us to protect. If this history moved you, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more untold stories from the darkest corners of our past. Because to truly understand history, we must first listen to those who were silenced by it.